Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. Very happy to welcome back Mahesh Thapa. Mahesh, how you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back. It's like a second home now these days.
That's it. Hopefully you're nice and cozy and you've made yourself nice and warm. You got a little blanket, just like at home. So always a pleasure to have you back. Mahesh is going to be talking about landscape photography. And one of my favorite things, which are APS-C lenses. All of our APS-C shooters out there, we didn't forget about you. So Mahesh is going to be addressing that today. I want to give a special shout out and thanks to our sponsors for the event, Sony. So thank you very much to them as well. Mahesh, I'm going to get out of your hair. If anybody does have any questions for Mahesh, please make sure to use the Q&A tab here on Zoom, or you can use the comment section on Facebook, Vimeo, and all of our streaming platform services. I will see you back shortly, Mahesh. All right.
All right. Thanks, Scott and Danny, Courtney. Great to see you guys. And I am so thrilled to be back again. I can't believe I keep getting asked back, but I'm happy to do it. I hope you guys like the content I'm about to present. As Scott mentioned, when people think about landscape photography, they think about, oh, medium format cameras, full frame cameras, but not a lot of love is given towards APS-C sensors and APS-C type lenses. And I think that's a little bit of a travesty because there's some great equipment out there, and there's, I think, a lot of misconception about what you really need and what you can get away with. Even if you want to make big prints, high quality images, astrophotography, high dynamic range stuff, it's all possible with the APS-C system. We get so hung up with full frame and medium format, we sort of forget about APS-C. And today, I want to talk to you a little bit about that and sort of talk to you about the gear that I use with a focus on Sony equipment, because I am a brand ambassador for Sony. That's one of my disclosures. But really, the information I provide can be applied to any manufacturer, because each manufacturer, I think, has their own set of great glass and equipment. If you're not particularly a Sony user, just sort of find the equivalent type of equipment in the other manufacturers, and you should be able to do the same thing. I want to make this a little bit of a mixed presentation in the sense that you're going to hear me talk like this. You're going to see me show some products online, talk about why I like it, but also a couple of slides about where I'm coming from, what the organization of this talk is. So let me just share a little bit of that right now, right here. Hopefully you guys can see this. And this is the topic of my talk, landscape photography, my favorite Sony APS-C lenses. Now, I thought about making this the best APS-C lenses for Sony, but there's so much varying opinion about that, depending on what your interests are, what your sort of capabilities are, your abilities are. And so I decided to make it my favorite Sony lenses with a bend on landscape photography. And all the images I show you are taken on an APS-C camera using an APS-C lens. Okay, so again, a couple of disclosures. I am a Sony ambassador, and some of the equipment that I mentioned was provided by Think Tank and Breakthrough Photography Filters, but they have not asked me or paid me to do any of this of the talking. It's just what I happen to use. So why APS-C for landscapes? The biggest things are basically listed here. It's smaller, it's lighter, it's considerably less expensive. You still get great image quality. And I wrote the word accessories here to remind me that even the accessories that you can get for these are quite a bit less expensive, whether they're filters, or lens adapters, what have you, remotes, camera attachments, they're all less expensive. So it really is worthwhile looking into, particularly if you're getting started into landscape photography. So right off the bat, let me tell you what I typically carry with me when I do my landscape photography. Again, remember, this is all landscape. So people say, oh, what about portraits? What about weddings? That's not my focus. My focus is landscape. So I don't want people getting angry at me saying that, hey, you didn't mention that lens, or you didn't mention that thing, or it's clearly not as good as full frame for this thing. But for landscape is sort of what I want to emphasize. And please keep that in mind as I mention all these things. So the body I use currently is the Sony a6600 camera body. I have it, I'll show you that in a few minutes. And I basically carry 3 lenses which sort of span the gamut of focal lengths that I like to use to capture my landscapes, whether it's ultra wide angle photography, standard lens photography, or telephoto sort of compression type of images that I sometimes go. And sometimes, there's wildlife that I encounter, and the bigger telephoto lenses are also really good for that. So the ultra wide, I use the Sony 10 to 18 millimeter f4 lens. I think it's an amazing lens for ultra wide angle landscape photography. And I love the fact that it's an f4, it's not an f2.8, so it's not heavy. When we talk about astrophotography, I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but for general purpose, ultra wide angle photography, wide open spaces, waterfalls where you want to get everything from the stream by your feet all up to the top of the waterfall. It's great for that. It takes very small filter threads. It's either 62 or 67 millimeter filter threads. I'll have to look at that. But again, because of that, it's going to be smaller equipment, less expensive equipment. As far as the only thing I wish the 10 to 18 had was weather sealing, because I do live in Seattle, and the climate can be a little inclement, as you can imagine, with all the snow and the rain and what have you. But still, I do a good job of sort of protecting my gear, so I don't mind it so much. For the size, the weight, and the portability, I'm willing to give up weather sealing. But if Sony's listening, if you could make this lens in a weather sealed version, man, that would be so ideal. The second lens I typically carry is a 16 to 55 G f2.8 lens. Now, this is a relatively new lens as far as APS-C camera lenses go for Sony, and I sort of switched to this lens because of the quality of the glass that was there. It's not just the 2.8. That is not as important to me really, but the quality of the glass, the periphery. When I stop down f4, f5, 6, f8, the periphery of the lens has just as much sharpness and micro contrast as the center of the lens. And typically in landscape photography, that's what I'm shooting at. I'm not shooting at f2.8. I'm not shooting at f4 typically. Usually I'm in the f5, 6, f8, f11 range, because I want to maximize that depth of field. So for those purposes, I think that that lens is awesome. Also, as I looked through a bunch of my images in Lightroom and I sort of categorized it by focal length, what focal length am I really using? Am I using ultra wide more? Am I using standard more or telephoto? I find that focal length, 1655, is amongst the most I've used. Even though I think of myself as an ultra wide angle photographer, I find myself, I think, reaching for the 1655 a lot more because of the nature of images I take with APS-C. I probably get a little slightly a smaller or narrower crop just because I want to maximize the megapixel per area of sensor. So I really like using that 16-55. Just what I've noticed for myself. And finally, the lens that I carry for my telephoto work in landscape is the 70 to 350 G optical image stabilized lens. Now it is a little slower, f4.5 to 6.3, but then I'm not doing super long exposure shots with this. Typically, it's sort of a compressed landscape. It's often maybe a little wildlife in the distance where I want to have relatively quick shutter speeds. It's a little slow at 6.3, but I am totally willing to sacrifice that slowness for the optical quality that this lens offers and the portability. I'll show you in a little bit the sort of the size differences between what the equivalent full frame is for this versus the APS-C. And I always get asked, well, what if I want to do astrophotography? Can you do astrophotography with these lenses? Yes, you can. You can even do it with the 10 to 18 millimeters, but it takes a little bit more patience. It takes a little bit more a forethought, a little bit more creativity, and maybe capturing multiple images and combining it. If you want to minimize the noise, you can achieve just as good images if you spend a little extra time sort of crafting that image by capturing multiple shots. But if you want a very ultra wide fast lens in place of the 10 to 18, or to complement the 10 to 18, I really like this Samyang 12 millimeter f2. Super inexpensive. It is manual focus only, which is not a problem at all for astro, because typically that's what I'm doing anyway. And I love the fact that it has a manual focus ring that stops at infinity, or has a physical stop. But most of these other lenses are sort of focused by wire, so you keep spinning and spinning and spinning. It just goes from one end to the other. Depending on how quickly you spin, it changes the focus distance based on that. But I love the fact that this manual focus lens by Samyang has a conventional focus ring that stops at both ends. And I'll mention that a little bit later and sort of demonstrate to you why I like that. And finally, if I want a slightly narrower equivalent focal length, the 12 millimeter is equivalent to about 18 millimeters, and the 16 is going to be more equivalent to 24 millimeters. So Sigma 16 millimeter f1.4 DCDN for the Sony mount is stupendous. It is amazing lens. The quality is unparalleled for that focal length from any manufacturer that I've seen, and that includes Sony. You know, so when Sony comes out with a great 16 1.4 equivalent at a good price, I mean, I may look into that, but for now, but it's a specialty lens, right? I use it just for a particular type of astro when I want to get a little narrower field of view than what the 12 millimeter applies. So, but when I need it, that f1.4 is crucial, particularly because it is an APS-C sensor, and there's a little bit of noise as you go to the higher ISOs. But again, those two other lenses I will add to the bag if I know I'm going and doing some astrophotography. You know what I didn't do? I didn't put up the chat function. So let me just look at what the chat says here. But I guess you guys will let me know if there's any burning questions. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them in the chat, and somebody could sort of relay them to me. I'll answer them as best I can. Now the question is, yeah, but can I do serious astrophotography? Definitely. I mentioned that this is an image I took with the 12 millimeter Samyang lens at Mount Rainier. This is a single exposure. You know, I didn't even have to combine multiple exposures at various ISO values to get this image. And, you know, could I have done a little better? Yes, marginally better, I think, with a full frame lens or medium format lens, with proper technique, going out at the right time, making sure you have a new moon, making sure there's no light pollution around, things like that. Those things actually go a longer distance, does more for your photography than the actual system that you're using. So clearly you can do astrophotography with the APS-C system. Well, I heard the dynamic range sucks. Well, you know, it's good. It's really good, particularly the modern sensors that that Sony makes, and basically any manufacturer really. I don't want to be too biased by say Sony makes the most amazing sensors. They do make great sensors, but I think if you're worried about dynamic range, all the manufacturers make really good dynamic range sensors. I do think Sony makes the best dynamic range, just from personal experience. But here's an example I took. That's my son in the foreground. The image on the left is the before, and the image on the right is the after. And all I did was take it into Lightroom and, you know, recover some shadows, recover the highlights. Could I recover a little bit more on a full frame, medium format? Sure, maybe a little more, but then it sort of gets into the garish HDR look that I'm not a big fan of. You can still get natural looking images. You know, you can recover 2.5 stops of light in the highlights and the shadows. I think very, very comfortably with minimal penalty as far as noise goes in the shadow and minimal banding in the highlights if you're shooting in raw imaging or if you're shooting in high quality TIFF. But dynamic range, for me at least, is plenty good enough on the APS-C sensors and lenses. And then the other question, I guess, is 24 megapixel enough for large prints, whatever large prints mean? I remember 20 years ago when I started shooting, I had an old Fuji S Pro 1. It was like a 8 megapixel camera, and still one of the best-selling images I have on my website was taken with that camera. It's a picture of Death Valley, and you know, I've made 20 by 30 inch prints from that. So is something good enough? You know, it all depends on many factors. The viewing distance, you know, how far are you standing away from a big print? Because the larger the print you have, the further away you're going to stand from that print to get the whole image in view. You're not going to go to it, but you know, like this and say, hey, does that look good close up? Are you willing to spend a little time in up-resing the images using a program like Gigapixel or what have you? That actually does a lot to increase the apparent megapixel size. What was the quality of lens you had? In other words, if you had a poor quality lens, no matter how many megapixels you had, it's not going to help you recover that detail. What's the subject matter? Are you shooting things with very, very fine detail, like cloth patterns? Are you shooting portraits where the fine detail isn't as crucial? Is it landscapes with a lot of mist and fog like this? You know, a lot of factors go into it. But I personally think that for sizes, really I made 20 by 30 inch prints with 24 megapixel cameras, even some that are larger. And I have never had anybody return a print because the quality of the material or the quality of the prints was bad. I mean, they may have liked the image, of course, but they never returned the image because, so, oh, you know, I can see pixelation there. Oh, you know what? It's not quite as sharp. So I think we get hung up a little bit too much on the megapixel race. And 24 megapixels, 12, 14, 16 megapixels, depending on what you shoot, is perfectly great. Okay, so that's sort of the end of what I wanted to sort of present as far as that goes. Let me stop the sharing. And hopefully this goes back to my sort of talking head type of image. I mentioned I have the A6600, and this is it right here, and sort of give you an idea of how small it is. You know, here's my APS-C sensor camera, and here is my full frame camera, both made by Sony. It actually is not that much bigger, the full frame, but when you sort of weigh it, it actually is quite a bit of difference, especially if you're carrying it around for long distances. If you're going backpacking, if you're going on longer hikes, that size actually makes a difference. And the great thing about this, at least this A6600 for me, is that it uses the same battery system as my Sony A7R4, and so I don't have to worry about buying new batteries for that. That's what I mainly use as my primary camera for landscape photography. If I'm shooting APS-C, if I'm going long distances, I don't have a lot to carry. I mentioned that the Trinity lenses that I typically take are the this one, 10 to 18, which is this one. It's pretty small. And you know what I've done? I've actually brought with me a little scale, a little scale, just to give you an idea of what this is. So this is the 10 to 14. I'm going to put it on my face so you can actually 10 to 18. And the 16 to 35 equivalent, I don't have with me right now, but it would be almost twice as big as this and almost twice as heavy. Looking at just this lens, I'm going to turn on my scale and I'm going to zero it out for you guys. This thing weighs right now 269 grams, okay? And the second lens that I said that I really like is this, the 16 to 55 f2.8G. It's a beautiful lens, well crafted, it's weather sealed. The one thing I didn't like about the 10 to 18 was the weather, but this is completely weather sealed. And you know, and that may actually have a lot to do with why I reach for this lens a little bit more quickly than I do for the 10 to 18, particularly since I'm shooting in inclement weather, waterfalls, what have you. It uses 67 millimeter filter thread, so that's perfect. I don't have to get huge filters for this. By the way, the 10 to 14, sorry, 10 to 18 used 62 millimeter threads, which is fine. Basically, I get one set of 67 millimeter filters if I'm using round filters, and I get a step down ring or step up ring. I can never keep track which is which. That lets me attach the 67 to the 62 millimeter. And the third lens I mentioned is this one. It's the 70 to 300. Let's see, hide my face. There we go. F6.3, right? 4.5 to 6.3. This is the optical image stabilized lens. So on the 6600, the image stabilization doesn't matter very much because it has in-body image stabilization. But the other two lenses I mentioned, it doesn't. But oftentimes in landscapes, I'm on a tripod, so I don't really care so much about image stabilization. But I think it is really good that they put it into this lens, the bigger telephoto lens. And I'll tell you why. There's some misconceptions out there that say, oh, you know what? When you have your camera on a tripod, turn the image stabilization off because the image stabilization tries to fight with the camera, and so it'll actually introduce softness, introduce blur because it doesn't really know that you're on a tripod. Not true anymore with the modern cameras. A lot of modern cameras have the ability to sense that you are actually on a tripod, so it may turn off the image stabilization on the lens or the body as necessary. But with a big telephoto lens, it's often hard to tell, and even minor movements like a little wind hitting the front element of your glass or the hood that you have on can have a little bit of shake that you may not appreciate right away. If you don't believe me, zoom out to like 500 millimeters on a tripod. You can notice that in the distance, there's some shake, and that's because of these micro movements that are happening. So image stabilization on will take care of that. So I really like the fact that this long telephoto lens has built-in lens image stabilization, unlike the other two, which I don't think it's really necessary for that. So those are the sort of three lenses that I always carry with me as far as landscape photography goes with my A6600. I mentioned two other lenses if I'm doing astrophotography. The first is this one. This is probably the one that I use the most if I want to do astro. This is the Samyang 12 millimeter f2 lens. It's tiny. I mean, let me show you how much it weighs. It weighs 309 grams, right? So these are actual measurements. It's not something that's from the manufacturer. You can actually see that it's 309 grams. Comes with a lens hood. Not all lenses come with a lens hood, so they do that. And it's super cheap. I think they'll put up the price for this, but it's super cheap. And I remember I mentioned what I loved about this lens was the fact that it had physical focusing ring. So it's a hard stop when you get to the minimal focus distance. And if you go this way, there's a hard stop at infinity. So much like with any manual focus lenses, there's a little line that says where infinity is. That line is frequently wrong. I hate to admit this, but most of the time, no matter what manufacturer I've used, like for example, if you went outside on a moonless night and it was dark and you said, oh, what, I'm just gonna move this lens to this infinity position, point my camera at the stars and start taking pictures, you're gonna get blurry images because it's inaccurate. What it says is the infinity point is inaccurate. Oftentimes what I'll do is you can't tell, but I've made a little line because if you look, you can actually go past infinity, right? So it's anywhere between here and here is where infinity, true infinity could be. So what I typically do is I make a line exactly where infinity is, and you can do that during the daytime. You point your camera to somewhere in the distance, trees, mountains, and manually focus, and you mark on your lens where exactly that point is. So at night, when you're struggling and don't have enough light, you can go directly to that mark that you made, and you'll be golden. Here's a pro tip. Make that mark with a green marker and not a red marker, because oftentimes red is difficult to see at night when you have light. The green will be a lot more conspicuous. So use a green marker, make that line, and you're fine. So that's another thing. If you had a manual focus lens that was purely by wire, you could never find that exact place where infinity was, and you'd have to go trial and error, which can be a pain. So I really like that feature on this manual focus lens by Samyang. The other lens I mentioned was the Sigma 16 millimeter f1.4. Actually, somebody is borrowing that lens at the moment, so I don't have that to show you. But go online, take a look. I think B&H actually has, I was just looking at it the other day, they have a sale going on the Sigma lenses. So consider that, because actually it's quite a deal right now. So those are the main lenses that I take. Now, you know, a lot of this stuff is in flux. For example, even if I'm going for a long trip, it's pretty cumbersome to carry these three lenses, the the 10 to 18, the 16 to 55 2.8, and the 70 to 350, even though it covers a lot of, but sometimes if I have to really do a lot of strenuous hiking, I don't want to carry even that. So I often say, okay, what am I likely going to be shooting? What am I after? Then I change my gear, what I carry with me based on sort of that mental process, just because every ounce counts. And for those occasions, I actually use sometimes a combination of APS-C lenses and a combination of full frame lenses. So let me give you an idea of what I'm talking about. One of my favorite lenses, that it's actually a full frame lens. It's relatively new. It's not very fast, but it's so sharp. It's super sharp. It came out with the Sony A7C camera as sort of a kit lens, and that's this one right here. This is the 28 to 60 f4 to f5.6. And let me show you how much this weighs. This weighs 182 grams. That is like nothing. My other APS-C lenses actually weigh a little more, but more than this. And it has this unique design where when you want to take the picture, you just sort of turn it and it extends to its full length, and then you can do the focusing and the change in focal length. So I really like that. So I take that as sort of my medium telephoto standard equivalent on my APS-C, and I pair it with the 10 to 18. So sometimes I take just those two lenses, and they make a great landscape kit where you get anything from almost a 90 millimeter equivalent in the telephoto range, and all the way down to a 15 millimeter on the ultra wide angle lens. So that's also great. What else do I take with me? If somebody asks me, okay, I have one camera and one lens, I don't want to change anything, okay? Give me the best bang for the buck. This is a relatively old lens, but I think it's still amazing for that purpose. Now, are there other lenses combinations that can make slightly better images? Yes, there are. But if you're just going to carry one lens, or if I was just going to carry one lens, I think you can't beat this one. This is the Sony 18-105 f4 lens. And it's f4, which is great. So it's not super fast, but it's not slow either. And it's a single maximum aperture. So no matter what focal length you use, it's still going to be great. And because it's an f4 lens, it's not very heavy. Now, it is a little big as far as lengthwise. So there may be a little, it may be a little cumbersome. There may be a little balance issue, in which I sometimes find if I'm trying to do video with this lens on a Sony APS-C sensor camera. But as far as a one lens system, this is really, really great. And one thing, and this is sort of love-hate, depending on who you are, it has power focusing. See, that's a telephoto and a wide angle. So you could also use the focus ring. That's no problem. Another thing about this is nothing juts out back and forth from the front element as you're changing the focal length or the zoom. It stays all internal, which is great for video work, by the way. But some people find that a little cumbersome, but you don't have to use the telephoto. There's no image stabilization. The aperture is controlled purely by the back of the camera. There are no aperture rings on this. But again, as a single lens system, for leave it on your camera and forget it, this is pretty good. If I have to just carry one, have absolutely no room for anything else, this is probably the one I would take. Now, sometimes people like to get lenses that they can use on both their APS-C and their full frame, because maybe they have two systems. And there are a couple of lenses that I really like for that. My really favorite is this one right here. This is made by Sony. This is the 20 millimeter f1.8G. On the APS-C, it becomes a nice 30 millimeter, so it's good for sort of wide angle portraits if you need some environmental portraits, a little more intimate landscape. And on a full frame, this is my go-to lens for astrophotography. I mean, I have a 14 millimeter 1.4, I have the 1635 2.8, I have all these lenses, but as far as portability, lightweight, optical quality, I think it's hard to beat this lens on a full frame. So I find a way to take this with me, whether I'm using an APS-C or full frame, particularly if I'm gonna, if I have both systems with me. Sometimes I have to do comparisons between one camera and the other. And this is a great sort of equalizer because the optical quality is so good that it can withstand the scrutiny of a very high megapixel sensor, yet is portable enough, accessible enough for an APS-C sensor. So I really like that. Okay. And every so often, when I want to be super lightweight, I take this lens with me. This is the Sony 16 millimeters f2.8. Now, I mentioned there's a Sigma f1.4. Is this better than a Sigma? No, it's not. But look how small it is. Look how tiny. So let me show you how much this weighs. This weighs 85 grams. 85 grams. That's nothing, right? So you could take a couple of, basically, if you wanted to do this 2.8, you can still do some good astro work with this if you wanted to. Plus, 16 millimeters gives you equivalent of 24 millimeter field of view. So if you're not into ultra wide angle photography, this can serve dual purposes as sort of a little slightly telephoto end of ultra wide and astro in the single lightweight. Pair this with the 28-60, and look at this. These two things with an APS-C. Imagine how light you can travel with this. That's a great combination. Just to give you an idea, you say, well, how much lighter is APS-C full frame comparison, right? So this is the full frame. I'm going to go back up a little. 24-70 f2.8 lens. Okay. The only thing sort of comparable to that is going to be this, the 16-55 f2.8. APS-C, let me bring that out. So that's about the size. So let me show you the difference in size between, and this is not an insignificant lens. I still feel the weight of this, but compared to this, it's nothing. And this is about as equivalent as you can get as far as aperture and focal length. So your APS-C sensor lens, 542 grams. I mean, not light, but 542, right? This one, 965 grams, almost twice the size and weight of the APS-C 2.8. And people get hung up with the fact that, yeah, but it's a full frame 2.8. 2.8 is 2.8. It's a ratio of your diameter lens and your maximum opening. So because it's a ratio, the light gathering ability of a 2.8 lens from a cell phone versus the 2.8 lens from a medium format, the light gathering ability is the same, right? So there's nothing magical about the fact that it's full frame or APS-C. Now there are other factors, sensor size, equivalent focal lengths, field of views that are different that can change the overall look of the image. But as far as how much light a lens can gather, that's what that 2.8 tells you. So I'm not hung up on that. So those are sort of the equivalent systems that I have. Now I have one last lens that I wanted to mention, and that is the 35 millimeter f1.8. So this is again a full frame lens, but it's so tiny and it's so small and it weighs 185 grams. So if you wanted to make a prime system, because some people like shooting primes for landscapes and some people like shooting telephoto, you could conceivably take this 35, which would be about a 50 millimeter equivalent. You could take the 28 millimeter, right, which would a 16 millimeter, which would be a 28 millimeter equivalent, and the Samyang 12 millimeter, which is the 18 millimeter equivalent, and you'd have a great prime setup to take with you for landscape photography. So those are the major lenses I typically deal with the APS-C system. Most of them are APS-C lenses, but a few of them are full frame lenses that I have adapted for APS-C system. I want to spend a few minutes talking about filters, just a little briefly about the sizes of some of the accessories that we have. So I have, for example, here is a sort of a graduated neutral density filter that I sometimes use, okay, for a full frame system. Now I'm going to show you something equivalent on APS-C. Look at this. Okay, so I'll put it side by side so you have an idea what they're like. Look at that. That's ridiculous. Basically, in this filter bag right here, which is a normal size filter bag that I would normally just put circular filters in, I can put all of these, whether it's a three-stop soft, three-stop hard, reverse grad NDs, polarizers, skylight filters, they all go into that little bag, just like I would do for a full frame system that has just circular filters. I can put these great rectangular and square filters and not have to worry about taking up a lot of room. So in a very small package, very small system, I have all this great gear that I can use to capture, I think, just as good images as with a full frame system if you use the proper technique, if you're careful. And in many ways, it makes you a better photographer because it puts a little bit of limitation on what you want to do. But in some ways, it's actually better for a landscape photographer because the equivalent depth of field, for example, is much greater on an APS-C sensor. So landscape photography, particularly for me, is all about how much depth of field I can get on a single shot, right? So if I shoot an APS-C sensor at f5.6, it's like shooting a full frame at f8. But I don't have to go to f8. I don't have to sacrifice that little bit of shutter speed or maybe the ISO. So people are sort of hung up on the fact that, oh, you know what? On the APS-C, the noise profile is not as good as a full frame. But to get the same equivalent field of view or depth of field, if you will, on a full frame sensor, you'd have to narrow that aperture by one stop. In other words, you'd have to shoot that shot at f8, but you could shoot that same shot on an APS-C at f5.6 and lower your noise profile by one stop. So it's equivalent, right? So there are other factors that go into it, but I think saying that the APS-C sensor, because it's smaller, it's noisier, it's a little bit of an oversimplification and not giving that system enough credit. So really think about that when you are considering sensor size, what you like to shoot, and equipment. Okay, I think we should maybe answer some questions or what at this point, if people have them.
Yes, yes, Mahesh, thank you so much. That was great. That was a great little overview of Sony and some of the APS-C line lenses. I loved the throwback early on to the Fuji S1. That made me feel like I've either been in this industry for way too long or I'm just getting really really old. So, or it could be both. It could be a combination of the both, because I remember that camera. That was a great camera. One of the things you mentioned, you know, and we talked about here, and I think some people don't realize, it depends on the camera that you're talking about. You know, with Sony, there's the crop factor, which I believe, if I'm correct, should be like a 1.5 time crop factor, which I think stays the same for most mirrorless systems. Some of them fluctuate a little bit. So you know that 16 to 55 effectively becomes similar to like a 24 to 82.5 millimeter lens, which is kind of close, like what you were saying, to that 24-70 lens. Now, obviously there's constraints and constrictions and things like that, but you know, for somebody who's thinking about just in terms of APS-C and kind of trying to compare, obviously you can't say it's apples to apples, because it's not. There's differences, there's sensor sizes, things like that. But you know, if you were to take the 24-70 f4, let's eliminate the 2.8 because that's just not fair. But let's say the 24-70 f4 and the 1655. Oh, he left me.
Better.
He went to go.
Better comparison. It's the 24 to 105 f4, which is probably a little bit more equivalent to that 16 to 55.
There you go. So if you're going, I mean, you've got the option that you can go APS-C or full frame. When you're going out, when you're shooting landscapes, are you grabbing the APS-C? Are you grabbing that full frame? What are you using? Are you going with that APS-C lens because of weight and everything you're packing with you? You know, how do you make that determination?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You know, a lot of it depends on where I'm going. And a lot of it depends on if I've been there before and I know what to expect and how far away it is, how many days I'm going for, and what can I realistically be comfortable carrying. In my other talks, I talk about the sort of comfort triangle, you know, where it's equipment weight, how much room you have, and how much comfort that you're willing to sacrifice to get to that pinnacle of image quality. And yes, the best image quality you're going to get is going to be with that Sony a7R4 61 megapixel camera, you know, the full frame lenses. But what might you have missed because you didn't travel a little more distance? If you didn't, because you didn't climb that extra hill because you were just so tired, and you know, maybe you didn't take an extra lens. In other words, when I travel with the when I travel with the full frame, I typically just take the 1635 f2.8 and the 24 to 105. You know, that's my focal length, because I can't take the 100 to 400 with me because that's just so huge, right? But now with the APS-C system, I can take the 10 to 18. I can take this, you know, 16 to 55, and I can take this. They all add up to about the same weight. So that's one extra lens. So if I know I'm, for example, going to, like when I went to Glacier National Park recently, I knew I was going to encounter wildlife, you know, but I didn't want to lug my, I forgot to mention this. So equivalent wise, I'm going to back up a little. This is the 200 to 600, right?
Tiny.
Look at that. Am I going to take this when I'm traveling, like hiking, or am I going to take this, right? So a lot of it depends on what my goals are. And like I said, it depends on if I've been somewhere before or not. If I've been somewhere, I know exactly the type of shot I want, because I often have to go to places multiple times to wait for the right light, to wait for the right conditions. And I know I'm going to so for that, I take the APS-C. because if it's a big distance, if it's a short distance and it's not so bad, then I take the full frame because I think it's a lot easier on the mind to realize how far you're going and what the company, because if you're unknown, because you don't know how long you're going to be out there, then for that I like the APS-C. But for known distances, particularly if it's reasonable, I take full frame.
Sure. So kind of following up on that, when you're going out, you mentioned this might be the first time you're going out somewhere. What kind of planning do you typically do when you prepare for something like that? Do you scout locations completely in advance? If you're traveling, say you're traveling abroad, or just even state to state, what is something like that look like in terms of your travel, of how you set that up and plan so that it's different than going down to the beach that you live locally to. You might be going a few thousand miles. You want to get that shot. You don't have that opportunity to go back.
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. And I think I'm lucky in the sense that I have this network of photographer friends that I have been able to collect, for the best way of saying it. And I feel like no matter where in the world I travel to, there's somebody I can contact and say, you know what, I'm going there. What do you recommend? So, but for somebody who can't do that, when I first started out, I used Instagram like it was going out of business. I used to look for hashtags for particular places. Like when I went to Australia a few years ago, I really didn't know very many people there. So I went to the Australia's official account and I saw all these pictures. And oftentimes they would list where they're taken. So I get the general idea. Sometimes they list, oh, we're in this hotel, on the balcony taking this, or if you take this street and you go to this particular area, you can get this view. So I use a lot of that type of information to make plans for where I'm going. If it's those are great for cities. I think if you're going for more outdoor backpacking, Google Earth is invaluable. I love being able to use that and figure out exactly what the perspectives are from particular locations, particularly if it's areas that it hasn't been explored very much. I also really like using apps like photo pills, where I can say, you know what, if I stand here, where's that sun going to rise? The sun's going to rise there. The moon's going to set over there. Are there any obstacles in the way that's going to limit what I do? And so that's sort of how I go about making my plans. I used to use 500 pics, but I find that not as helpful as some of the other social media platforms right now. But I'm lucky enough to say that I have so many photographer colleagues and friends now that I often sort of use them as my crutch to help me out. And I return the favor when they're asking about where I've been.
As you have to, otherwise you're in trouble. So I know you're a guy, and this is one of the things I love about having you on here is, you've always got everything close by at the fingertips. You're able to grab things left and right. I love that. You're always prepared for the oddball question or the challenge. Besides, obviously, we discussed a little bit about lenses. We discussed a little bit about filters. What else does your packing look like? What else do you keep at hand when you're going out for a landscape shoot?
Yeah, I always, well, now that you mention it, I have it here.
I thought you might.
Okay, so I have a few bags, and I'll show you exactly what I carry with me. Okay. All right, let me get this out here. Some pins. I'm going to put this right over here. So if you noticed on my camera, I've had the little tripod adapter. It's made by Peak Design.
Yeah.
And I like that adapter because I have so many other things that I can adapt it to. So when I'm wearing my backpack, I have a little mount, so I can put it right over here that I travel with. So that's super convenient. So I can just put that on, take it off whenever I need to, and put it back on and not have to worry about it. And some of my equipment is weather sealed and some of it is not. And for the times, where I just hang it on my back, this is another sleeve, sort of a rain protector made by Peak Design. And it goes right over the camera and the lens, and it's completely waterproof. It's made by neoprene. And it just sort of sits on the camera like this. So I really rely on this to protect my gear. And I mentioned this on a prior, but this is a filter wrench, right? And sometimes when I use circular filters, and there's a drastic change in weather or humidity, going from elevation to elevation or environment to environment, it can get stuck if it has stacking filters, or if the front element is metal, and so is the filter, and it's almost impossible to take off. So this has come in very handy to wrap around the edge of the filter and turn to get that out. And of course, I carry around I'll just tell you, I carry my iPad Pro. That's what I'm using nowadays to do my editing. And I carry a little 2 terabyte SSD drive by SanDisk to offload all my images on. I always carry a big yellow cloth to wipe down my equipment. So people joke about this. I had this out a few minutes ago, but because you just never know, some biodegradable toilet paper. Because you just never know. And I take, sometimes I get headaches and stuff, so I take some medication with me in a small pill box. But that's really it. Those are the essentials for when I do some traveling.
Sure. Do you ever, I mean, tripod wise, let's talk tripods for a second. I know you love your tripods. I know you love talking about them. Are you a carbon fiber guy? Are you an aluminum guy?
I am a carbon fiber, Brett. I mentioned last time, and I was just using it this morning to take some pictures for my balcony. Here it is. Yeah, here it is. This is the tripod I use, and it's not fancy. It's a relatively inexpensive tripod made by a company called Leo Photo. It's the Ranger LS255 CEK, and on it I've got the this time I've got the archetype ball head, which has independent turns for well, you can change the ball head like this, and if you want to panel, you can just change this. So I really like this. Very lightweight. It's sort of a traveler series. It is carbon fiber. I've tried them all. I've tried Gitzo, Manfrotto, and they're all great. But I think they've gotten to the point where if you get a good carbon fiber tripod, they're just as light, they're just as durable. And this is what I happen to be using recently, and I've been using this for a couple of years. Sorry. One other thing I really like about this tripod, I forgot to mention, it has a built-in leveling base, which is this thing right here. The leveling base is essential, I think, because oftentimes you're on sort of unsteady terrain, and to be able to just flip a switch like this and then change the leveling minor amounts to get it perfectly level is essential. Yeah, I really like that feature. That's the main reason I have this tripod.
And it looks like it also has a little bit of a ball level in there to see that you're actually within that range and you're actually flat.
Yeah, and but that is, for me, is not as crucial, because oftentimes cameras have a leveler on it,
Sure.
which I rely on.
If you've got a wonderful Sony camera. That's right. If you don't, you might be in trouble. You might not have that feature. So all you Sony users out there, you're ahead of the curve.
It's funny you should mention that, because oftentimes you look out in the horizon and in the camera and the balls, everything's level, but it doesn't look level, because the terrain may be a little slightly off. My advice to people is that it doesn't matter what the camera says is level. You make it look level on your field of view, then that's what people are going to see. They're not going to see what's on your camera or what's on your leveling base. It's like, how does it look when you look through the viewfinder? And sometimes you may have to make it slightly off level to make it look level.
Definitely. But for people like me, I will say, I don't know if it's got to be me. I think I'm just a little bit off balance. Maybe one leg is longer or shorter than the other. Because I always wind up coming back from shoots and things just look a little, off. So
well, I think that's actually a very common complaint when I run workshops. People say, how come I never look, even though the camera, because the horizon sometimes may not be level. So when you have, for example, a water line between land line, the water line comes in, goes out, but sometimes that could be a little off. So even though, yes, you're probably perfectly straight, the water line itself is a little off. So that's why I have people turn on their grids and say, okay, just line that line up to that horizon point, or wherever you think it should be straight. Then you'll have that's actually a much more common complaint than you realize.
Yeah, no, I've got it all. I've got the level. I've got the grid. I've got anything to assist me and not make me have to take a picture. If it'll just push the button for me, I'm in. Sign me up.
That's right. That's right.
So I wanted to go back to filters for a second because it's something we talked about a lot, and I think that there's kind of a misconception or misunderstanding from people amongst them. You know, can you maybe talk a little bit about why would someone choose a circular filter, something that's round in size, versus going with something that's like a square 4x4, 4x6, that kind of filter that, you know, typically uses a filter holder?
Yeah, no, we're going to get a lot into filters on part 3 of this talk, which should have a couple weeks, but I'll give you sort of a quick answer to this. I personally I have nothing against circular filters. I think they're great. As long as all you do is use a polarizer and neutral density filter, so maybe a skylight filter, you know, because it's uniform. There are certain circular filters out there that actually say, oh, we are grad ND filters. And what they do is they put a transition between very dark to clear, and they put the transition right in the middle, exactly the place we probably don't want to do the composition, top pack art. So I don't recommend those types of graduated filters that are circular. Anytime you go into graduated filters like grad ND, reverse grad ND, so on, then the square or the horizontal or the rectangular filters are the way to go, because then you could change exactly where that horizon is as you move that filter up and down. Sort of looking at this as a guide, you know, I mean, yes, the transition from super dark to super clear is right at the middle, but you can change where that transition happens, right? As I go like this, you can change where that transition happens, and not having just the middle or just to the top, how gradual that is. Another benefit of square filters is that you can adapt it to many different types of lenses, whether you have a 49 millimeter front element or 82 millimeter front element. One set of filters will probably take care of that. You could conceivably get a single set of large 82 millimeter circular filters and get adapter rings, but that becomes cumbersome. Now, for let's say, for example, you have one of those bulbous element 14 millimeter, f2.8 lens with a bulbous element where you can't put a circular, then you have to do square filters. So if you were to get one set of filters, right, probably get square filters if you can. It'll go a longer way. But if you only plan to do ND filters and polarizers, particularly if you do a lot of video work, then I think circular is just fine.
Awesome, awesome. And so I did want to address this question that we got in regarding the third-party lenses. You know, one of the things that I think you mentioned that's very important to kind of keep in mind is a lot of these don't really have a stop. They don't have an infinity mark on them where you can just kind of stop and everything like that, which you mentioned these do. But talk a little bit about the metering on them. Do they also allow for metering and functionality like that, or do you have to manually meter for them as well?
No, they do. Because the metering is actually happening on your camera. So at least that's what's happening for Sony. That's my experience. And we've got the great benefit of an LCD screen and histogram, right? So I don't, oftentimes, even with the native lenses, native camera, I don't trust what it says. I actually look at the histogram and say, oh, I have to decrease the aperture. I have to increase the shutter speed so that my histogram is exactly where I want it to be. So I rely heavily on the histogram and less so on what the camera thinks the metering should be for that scene.
That's it. Tell the camera what it needs to be told.
Exactly.
There you go. Sometimes it needs to be told that.
Well, I really believe landscape photography is probably one of the most difficult forms of photography to do the right way. I do a lot of bird photography, wildlife photography, and that's basically, you shoot it at 1/2000th of a second, maximum aperture, and you spray and pray. You hope you got a nice, the eyes are in focus. There's not much thinking. You have to be skilled to be able to follow the bird. Get the migratory patterns. Portraits. You put it on eye autofocus, continuous autofocus, and you just take some shots. With landscape, there's a lot of thought involved. What kind of, what is your maximum depth of field? What is your hyperfocal distance that you want to, what part of the image do you want to focus and what parts don't you want to focus? If you change the aperture from f4 to f8, how am I going to have to adjust the ISO if I'm not using a tripod so that my shutter speed is fast enough to not get a blurry image. Now, do I need to have image stabilization or not? So I think it's a lot more of a thinking process. And people think, well, landscape photography, you can sit there and stand forever. But when that light changes, you have like maybe 2 minutes before you get that perfect light. So I want people to appreciate that landscape photography is a difficult thing to do the right way because there's so many things you have to think about.
Definitely, definitely. And like you said, you can show up 1 minute late or 1 minute, early and you can get that shot, or you can completely absolutely miss it. And
Right.
you might see something in the viewfinder and then go to take the shot and then it's instantly gone.
And you
Um,
never know when the good instant is. And many times I'll go shoot a sunset or a sunrise. And oh, beautiful color. I'm done. I'll pack up. 10 minutes later, it's even better. So
yeah.
you have a hard time. So you really, and it's hard to judge how good the quality of light is minute by minute because your eye is not, it's hard to look back a minute ago unless you sort of look back on your images.
Well, yeah, that's it. Unless you took that picture already.
Yeah.
There you go. Well, Mahesh, thank you so much for being here. I want to remind everybody who's tuned in today that Mahesh will be back here next week, right?
Yeah, next week I'll be talking about the optimal settings that I recommend on your camera, whether using APS-C, full frame, what have you, to get the best quality images for your camera. And then the following week we're doing a deep dive on the different type of filters that are out there and when, why, and how you should
How?
use them.
Who, what, when, why, how? I think that's how it goes. So if
Right.
if you haven't already, go ahead, check out the B&H event space page on bnhphoto.com, or you could always stay up to date with everything that we're doing at our Instagram account, BH Event Space. You could follow us, tag us, all that good stuff. We like it, we enjoy it. We want to be part of the community and part of your journey. So make sure you're doing that. Mahesh, thanks so much for being here again. I want to give a huge thanks again to our sponsor for the event, who definitely without them, we wouldn't be able to get wonderful people like Mahesh. So thank you very much to Sony.
Pleasure, Scott. Thank you very much, everybody, for making this such a great event.
That's it. We really appreciate it. We'll see you back here next week. For everybody
Okay.
else, this is another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. We'll catch you next time.